Right, so in the previous segment, we were talking about grazing fauna or grazing animals and how they came to evolve. And we ended talking about the grasses and the animals going through coevolution together. And coevolution, again, is where one species is going to evolve in response to the characteristics of another species. So in the U.S., our grazing fauna or grazing animals actually can be traced back to having when the Earth went through major climatic changes around 10,000 or 8,000 years ago. And this caused a lot of our big mammals to go extinct. So mastodon and buffalo. We still have bison today, but there were even larger species of bison, caribou, and muck ox that actually persisted on rangeland. And so the original grasslands in the western part of the US were grazed or were browsed if their shrubs were present. And then they were trampled by these megafauna or these very large herbivores that are now extinct today. Anywhere from about 150 to 5,000 years ago, bison actually ended up being the dominant herbivore. And so keep in mind that is bison, it's not buffalo. Bison is what we have here in North America. Buffalo we see in other continents, specifically in Asia and India. So around also in this time frame, we also saw other species become predominant in the U.S. So those are going to be our pronghorn antelope, black-tailed deer, some of the tule elks, grizzly bears, and other small mammals such as squirrels, gophers, rabbits, and kangaroo rats. And all of these fauna together have made massive impacts to California grasslands, and those are both good and bad. And we're still addressing some of those impacts today, and in some cases, we're trying to preserve them. So, the next step in grazing fauna really happened in the last 150 years, and this is where livestock species, specifically domestic livestock species, have been the dominant grazers in the US, specifically in the West. All right, so we've got a timeline here that over the last 150 plus years that we're going to look at. And we're going to start with when cattle and horses actually first arrived. So the this actually happened with Coronado and Cortez in about 1540, and those animals came to the U.S. Up through Mexico in most cases. And then by 1650, wild horses were very common in the U.S., so it wasn't any it wasn't a big issue like it is today because they were managed by the environment and by our native peoples. And then by 1790, shortly after the Revolution, cattle and sheep were actually introduced in the northwest part of the U.S. And between the late 17th century and about halfway through the 18th century, we really started seeing people move west and settling the Northwest and the Pacific coast. And by about 1850, there were a lot of animals on the Palouse Prairie, and that is going to be the Intermountain Grasslands that is in eastern Oregon, western Idaho, and eastern Washington. Then by 1860, the West was pretty well settled. A big part of that was the gold rush in California. And as the territories slowly started to become states, we started to see these several of these acts come into place. And 1862 was a big year of acts that President Lincoln put forward to try to help settle the West. So the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad Act, and then the Morrill Act. And we're going to study those in more detail. At the end of the Civil War, there was a lot of people ended up moving west, and what ended up happening is they brought livestock with them, and so the number of animals on rangelands in the West really started to increase. Pretty drastically in numbers. So between about 1870 and 1880, a short 10-year span, cattle numbers reached the peak number in the western United States. And so what we ended up having was ranchers actually turning animals out on land that wasn't really owned by anybody at that point in time. And so they saw all this available forage there, so they decided to increase their herd because at that point in time, total numbers or livestock was actually sold by the head and not by the pound. And then in 1886 and 87, we actually saw a massive drought happen. Like, not quite as bad as what we had been through in 2014 and 2015, but bad enough. So, high stock numbers coupled with drought really degraded rangeland. And then by 1890, the resources that rangeland could provide were severely reduced because of these high numbers of inventories and major climatic changes. All right, so realize that as we're talking from about 1540 to 1850, the West wasn't really settled very much at all. And so it was after 1850 and the gold rush that we really started seeing people flock west. All right, so as we look more at the history of domestic livestock, again, Cortez was the first settler that actually brought livestock into Mexico in 1515, and then and he was really predominant in developing the Mexican livestock industry. And then shortly after that, in 1540, Coronado actually brought livestock into the U.S. from Mexico. So Cortez got the livestock to Mexico, and then Coronado was able to bring those that livestock from Mexico up into the U.S. in 1540. And the livestock in this sense was cattle, sheep, and horses for the most part. And so after those animals actually ended up in the U.S., they came through the valleys such as the Sonoran Valley, the Mesilla Valley, and the El Paso Grande Valley. And as people were starting to settle those southwestern states and move a little bit north, like up into Colorado, those animals were beginning to escape, and they would start stalking the ranges. So they became they became the feral animals, and was really a big source of the horses that ended up in the United States as well. So still Spanish by blood, but feral, not wild. All right, so in terms of California, even though we saw a few of those animals come up through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas actually make it to California, the big push in the West was the development of the missions. And so this happened between the 16 and the 1800s. And these missions were established along major rivers in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and California. So in California, we've got roughly 40 missions, I believe. I would have to check my facts there. And those were actually settled to try to convert the native people to become Catholics, and so they tried to Christianize the Native Americans. In addition to trying to get them to become Christians, they also wanted to teach them farming and animal husbandry. And then 1849 happened, and they found gold at Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. So the discovery of gold really created a huge rush of individuals to come to the West. And as those people came to the West, there was a demand for more meat to feed the gold mining crews, all the families that were moving this way. So that actually resulted in about 500,000 sheep being trailed from to California from New Mexico. So New Mexico has always been a big sheep state and still is. And so a lot of the animals that we have in California actually got their roots from New Mexico that had come up through Mexico as well. And then that we also saw quite a few sheep being trailed north to Utah, where there was a large amount of silver mining going on, and also to Colorado, where there were setting up gold mining settlements as well. All right, so 1862 is where we saw a big shift in the livestock industry and how it actually started to become an industry. So, in 1862, one of the three main acts that really helped to settle the West was the Transcontinental Railroad Act, or the TRA. And this is where specific sections of land for several miles in length on either side of the railroad tracks were actually given to the railroad companies like Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, and then those all morphed into BNSF that owns the large part of the train companies in the West today. So this was a company. This act really fueled the push to get all of the railroads in. So we saw completion of the railroad into Kansas by 1866, and this really helped get people from the east to the west, as well as goods, people, and livestock. So between the 1870s and the 1880s, we saw an inflation, a huge inflation of livestock and people in the West. So at this point in time, cattle were being raised pretty cheaply in the West, being put on rail cars and sent east to Chicago and the Kansas City and the St. Louis markets, and were being sold by the head at that point in time. So, because they were being sold by the head, the more animals that they actually could produce, the bigger their paycheck was. So, there wasn't this whole concept of bigger is better at that point in time. More numbers were better. And so, with that, really came a large amount of Western cattle operations that were using federal, or what we now call as federal lands, being degraded because they were overstocked. So, to put this in perspective for you, between 1870 and 1884, we actually saw a 35 million head increase in cattle in 14 short years. So, the 1870 population was roughly 4.6 million cattle in the West, and by 1884, it had grown to 35 to 40 million cattle. Unbelievable.